The clinic's soft, dim lighting bathed the room in a golden hue, casting long shadows against the walls. Dr. Adrian Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk as he reviewed the patient file before him. He was a man of undeniable charm, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that made hearts flutter. His deep blue eyes held secrets, and his well-groomed stubble only added to his irresistible aura. The door creaked open, and she walked in. Elena Brooks, a vision of delicate beauty with long, wavy brown hair and piercing emerald eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. She had been his patient for months now, and while their interactions had remained professional, there had always been an unspoken tension in the air. "Miss Brooks," Adrian greeted, his voice rich and smooth, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Doctor," she replied, barely above a whisper, as she lowered herself into the chair before him. His gaze traveled over her, taking in the way her fingers fidgeted in her lap, the way her breath hitched slightly. He smirked. She was nervous, but not because of the checkup. "You seem tense," Adrian observed, leaning forward slightly. Elena swallowed hard. "It's just been a long day." "Is that all?" he asked, his voice low, teasing. She knew he could see through her lie. He always could. Without breaking eye contact, Adrian reached for her wrist, his fingers brushing against her skin as he checked her pulse. He held it a second too long, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles. "Your heart is racing," he murmured. Elena inhaled sharply. "Doctor, Relax," he interrupted, his other hand gently massaging her shoulder. The touch was soothing, yet electrifying, as if 1,000 sparks ignited where his fingers lingered. Her eyes fluttered shut for a brief moment before she caught herself. "We shouldn't," she whispered. "But you don't want me to stop," he countered, his lips hovering inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. The air between them thickened. The clinic walls felt smaller, the tension unbearable. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, she closed the gap. The moment their lips met, a fire ignited between them. Slow, consuming, impossible to resist. But just as passion threatened to consume them, a sudden knock on the door made them freeze. Elena gasped, pulling away. We can't," she stammered, breathless. Adrian's smirk deepened. "This is just the beginning." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs as she pulled away from Adrian's intoxicating touch. The sharp knock on the clinic door had shattered the moment, but the fire still burned between them. Her lips tingled from his kiss, her body betraying the rational thoughts screaming inside her head. Adrian smirked, his gaze locked onto her flushed face. He leaned back in his chair, completely unbothered, as if nothing had happened, yet his darkened eyes told a different story. "Come in," he called out, his voice calm and composed. The door creaked open, and a nurse peeked inside. "Dr. Carter, your next appointment is waiting." Adrian gave a slow nod, but his attention remained on Elena. "Thank you. I'll be done here in a few minutes." The nurse disappeared, shutting the door behind her. The room was silent except for the sound of Elena's uneven breathing. She stood up abruptly, smoothing her dress, trying to compose herself. "I should go," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. Adrian rose from his chair, stepping toward her with deliberate slowness. "Are you sure?" His voice was rich, laced with something dangerous. She turned away, but he caught her wrist, gently pulling her back. His touch sent a jolt of heat through her body, making her knees weak. "Elena," he murmured, his fingers tracing up her arm. "I know you feel it too." She did. She had felt it from the moment they met. This unexplainable pull toward him. The way his voice made her breathless. The way his mere presence set her skin on fire. "This is wrong," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Adrian chuckled softly, tilting her chin up with his fingers. "Then why haven't you left?" She parted her lips to respond, but no words came. And then he kissed her again. This time, it was deeper, more urgent, as if he wanted to claim every breath she had left. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her against his firm body, and she melted into him. Her fingers tangled in his dark locks, her body pressing closer, craving more. His lips left a scorching trail down her neck, his breath warm against her skin. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against her collarbone. But she couldn't, because she didn't want him to. Elena clung to Adrian as his lips moved over her skin, his touch setting fire to every inch of her body. The clinic walls felt like they were closing in, trapping them in a moment that neither of them wanted to escape. But then her conscience screamed at her. With a gasp, she pushed against his chest, creating a small distance between them. Adrian, we can't. His blue eyes darkened, but he didn't let go of her waist. Tell me you don't want this, he challenged, his voice husky. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her body still burned from his touch, her lips still tingled from his kiss. You can't, he smirked, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Because you do. Elena swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step back. This isn't right. You're my doctor. Adrian chuckled, running a hand through his dark locks. I'm also a man, Elena. And you? His gaze traveled over her trembling figure. You're a woman who wants me just as much as I want you. She turned away, rubbing her temples. This was a mistake. His expression shifted, amusement flickering into something unreadable. He stepped closer, his voice softer this time. Do you really believe that? She hesitated. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed in her purse, snapping her back to reality. She grabbed it quickly, her breath hitching when she saw the name flashing on the screen. Daniel, her fiancé. Guilt slammed into her like a wave. What had she done? Adrian's jaw tightened as he noticed her hesitation. Your fiancé? He guessed, his voice laced with something unreadable. She nodded slowly, gripping the phone but not answering it. The ringing stopped, but the silence between them grew heavier. Adrian exhaled sharply, stepping back. I see. His tone was unreadable, but his eyes held something raw, something that sent a pang through her chest. Elena! He reached for her hand one last time, but she pulled away. I have to go, she whispered, turning toward the door. As she walked away, her heart pounded for all the wrong reasons. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't over. And Adrian Carter wasn't the kind of man to let go easily. Elena barely remembered the drive home. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Her mind clouded with thoughts of Adrian. His touch, his kiss. The way he looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. But as she pulled into the driveway of the apartment she shared with Daniel, reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Daniel, her fiancé. He was waiting for her, standing by the door with a warm smile. His brown eyes filled with love and trust. The same trust she had just shattered. Hey babe. He wrapped his arms around her, kissing her forehead. You're home late. She forced a smile, hoping he wouldn't notice how stiff she was in his embrace. Yeah, the checkup took longer than expected. A lie. Daniel led her inside, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. I made dinner, he said proudly, gesturing to the table set with candles, wine, and her favorite pasta. Elena's heart twisted with guilt. Daniel was good. He was kind. He had been there for her through everything. So why couldn't she stop thinking about Adrian? As they ate, Daniel talked about his day, but Elena barely heard a word. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Her breath hitched when she saw the message. Adrian *, we're not finished, Elena. She sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the phone. Everything okay? Daniel asked, watching her closely. Elena forced another smile. Yeah, just a work message. Another lie. That night, she lay beside Daniel in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body restless, her mind replaying every moment with Adrian. She could still feel the way his lips had claimed hers, the heat of his touch lingering on her skin like a ghost. She had to end this. The next morning, she drove back to Adrian's clinic, her heart pounding. The moment she stepped into his office, he was already there, leaning against his desk, arms crossed, that knowing smirk on his face. You came back, he murmured, eyes dark with something dangerous. Elena clenched her fists. This has to stop. Adrian took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. Is that what you really want? His voice was smooth, hypnotic. She opened her mouth to say yes, but before she could, he reached out, cupping her face. And just like that, she was his again. Elena's breath hitched as Adrian's fingers caressed her cheek, his touch igniting the fire she had tried so hard to extinguish. Her body betrayed her, leaning into him despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. This has to stop, she whispered again, but her voice lacked conviction. Adrian smirked, his thumb grazing her lower lip. Then why are you here, Elena? She had no answer. Because the truth was terrifying. She wanted him. She had always wanted him. And no matter how much she tried to fight it, the pull between them was stronger than logic, stronger than reason. Adrian leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from hers. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice laced with temptation. Elena's heart pounded. Adrian. But she couldn't say the words. And he knew it. With a deep, consuming kiss, he claimed her once more. His hands roamed her body, pulling her closer, making her forget everything. Her morals, her engagement, the life she was supposed to have. In that moment, nothing else existed but him. But passion always comes with a price. A sudden knock on the door made Elena jolt. Before she could step away, the door swung open, revealing Daniel. Her fiancé stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and devastation. Elena's stomach dropped. Her breath left her in a sharp gasp. Daniel. But he didn't say a word. He just stared at her, at Adrian, at the undeniable proof of her betrayal. The silence was suffocating. Adrian, ever composed, took a step back, his expression unreadable. But his eyes held no regret. No remorse. Only certainty. Daniel swallowed hard, his fists clenching at his sides. So this is why you've been acting different, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears burned Elena's eyes. But what excuse could she give? What could she possibly say to undo the damage? Daniel shook his head, his face contorting with pain. I trusted you. His voice cracked, and it shattered something inside her. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Elena felt her entire world crumble. She looked at Adrian, searching for something, guilt, regret, anything. But he only studied her with those piercing blue eyes. This changes everything, she whispered. Adrian simply smirked. No, darling. This is just the beginning. And deep down she knew he was right. Because once you cross a line like this, there's no going back.